Hello, Year 6. This is Mrs. Hudson here. I hope you are all okay. I'm really excited to be joining Garibaldi School in September. I know that we in the History Department are really excited to be meeting you. So I am Mrs. Hudson, the lead teacher of history, but there are three other history teachers within our department. There are Mr. Brown, Miss Bartley, and Mr. Dawson, who's also the deputy head. Hopefully, you might have had a chance to meet us already if you came up for the open evening and saw some of our displays, like the torture display going on. And Bradley, one of our students, talking to you about medieval medicine. But if you didn't get the chance, no worries, you'll be here hopefully in a few weeks anyway. So I'm going to talk briefly to you about what got me into history and why I think it's really important. And then we're going to talk through a little bit about the topics that you'll be looking at this year in more detail. I first got into history when I was really young. In the top left-hand corner, you'll see a Roman coin. And this is actually something that I now own, but that my dad used to show me a lot when I was young. He had found it, and I was like really amazed that I could hold something in my hand that was nearly 2,000 years old, and that you could tell me that people bought and sold things, and it told me about who the emperor or the ruler was at that time. And I found it amazing that this one piece of evidence could tell me so much. As I went on, I got really interested in primary school in the horrible histories books. I wasn't as lucky to have the horrible histories on CBBC around when I was young, but I absolutely love them now. I found it great that there was so much interesting information out there. And alongside my history teacher, who was called Mr. Blair, I couldn't find a picture of him, so I had to have a bit of a cartoon there. He really instilled this love of history and how it's interesting and how it impacts on our lives. And as I've grown older, I've gone to see things, and these are things that you might possibly have gone out and seen, or other things. I really like going to visit places. So on the bottom left are some of the places I've visited. The Colosseum in Rome, where the gladiators fought. I've been on school trips to the World War One trenches, the Acropolis in Greece, and the Tower of London. And one of my favourites, do this quite often on school trips, is the Black Country Museum. It's an outside living museum, which means that you get to go round and go down the mines and go along the old canals where they took the coal. You get to see the metal works, and my favourite bit is when you get to go to the fish and chip shop and try the old-fashioned fish and chips. And I find these things, all of these things together, have taught me about history. It's not just about reading books. It's not just about watching horrible histories on the TV. It's a bit more than that. But loads of things that you can experience just in your everyday life will help build up your knowledge and understanding of history. So, what is history and why should we study it? Well, history is obviously the study of the past, particularly human characteristics or human features. So why should we study it then? My first reason is that history helps us to understand our past, which in turn helps us to understand our present. I think especially if you've seen the news in the past few weeks, there's been lots of talk about Black Lives Matter and statues being pulled down. And whatever your viewpoint is on these matters, it's important to understand, well, what led to these situations? Why do people want to pull down statues? Why is it important to them? Why do some people think it's wrong? The more you understand about what's happened previously, the better you can understand what's going on today. So I also believe that history can help us to become good citizens, and that kind of links to what I've just previously said. It helps us to understand different perspectives and to form our own opinions and to make judgments wisely. So it's going to be really important to you throughout your school career and when you go into jobs to think about what you believe in, what your opinion is, and you should base that on really good knowledge. But it's also important to understand that different people are going to have different points of view to you, and it's about how you interact with people who might have a different perspective. How do you argue your point? When do you learn to understand their point, and where can you make your own judgments? Okay, how do you form your own opinions? My other bit is we can learn about world events and how they have impacted on Britain and other countries. So we have obviously teach you quite a lot in year 8 about the British Empire and how we went over to other countries and they became part of our empire, and we talk about positive and negative impacts, but we can also talk about events that have happened in other countries that have impacted on us. So things like September 11th, the the Cold War, things like that. My next point is we can come to explore how our culture therefore came about, how we are linked to other cultures and countries. Because we live in a globalised society, we now have a lot to do with other countries around the world, whether that's through trade or through war, lots of different methods, some good, some not so good, but we have an impact on each other. But this isn't just like a recent thing. If we actually go back in the kind of history of Britain, we start off in our course pretty much with the Romans and how they came over to our country and invaded and settled. And then we look at the Anglo-Saxons, and it's about how different groups of people over time have altered us as a country, and how some of the things that we expect to be British perhaps aren't. So, for example, your very British cup of tea is actually from China and from India. You could look at the Christmas tree, something we see as a very British tradition, that actually is a German tradition from the 16th century, which Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, actually brought over to our country. You could even talk a little bit about the good old-fashioned British fish and chips. The battered fish aspect of it was actually brought over with Jewish refugees from Portugal and Spain, although I do believe that we were the first people to put the battered fish and the chips together, so perhaps that one is a little bit British still. And the reason that we should study history is because it's really interesting. There's so many different kind of perspectives and countries and events that happen. It's really interesting to see how these things come together and how they help to develop us. So, first term then. I'm going to start you off in the first few weeks having a bit of a go at historical skills, just to kind of see where you are with those, just to practice them, and see how good you are at putting them into place. So we'll look at chronology, which is the study of dates, putting things in time order. We'll see how good you are at using evidence, historical evidence, to kind of work out some mysteries. Reliability of sources. Who do we trust? Who do we not trust? And why? That's really important when we look at interpretations and sources, thinking about, well, what's the motive behind this? Why did this person create this? What was their purpose? And then, as we talked about earlier on, you starting to make your own judgments, having your own opinions about things based on what the evidence tells you. So, in the next couple of weeks, then, after that, we'd move on to ancient medicine and the Romans. So we'll look at prehistoric medicine, Egyptian medicine, and Hippocrates and Galen. Now, some of you have done some elements of, especially Egyptian medicine, I believe, at primary school, but we look at it in a slightly different way because we're trying to work out the development of medicine over time, okay, and things like change and continuity. Why did things get better? In some ways, what was still holding it back? What has to change for medicine to develop? And this is something that will actually run through whether your 3-year course at history, if you choose to do it only up to year 9, or it'll run through the whole 7 years if you choose to do it up to A level, that kind of idea of development and changing points in history. When we move on to the Romans then, again, something you might have done slightly at primary school, but doing it in a slightly different way at secondary school. Why did the Romans want an empire? An empire is one of our key themes that, again, runs through the whole 7 years of history, of your history teaching. And it's that development of, well, what is an empire? Why did people want it? What are the positives and negatives? What problems can these cause? How does this link to imperialism? Now, you're not going to do all of that in year 7, but there is a pattern or there is a path that you will take to develop your skills in that area. What was their system of government like? How did the Romans keep law and order? As you can see from the middle picture there, with the man being thrown off the cliff, it wasn't always particularly nice. It was a bit brutal at times, but we have to investigate the reasons why. Was Roman public health effective? If you look on the top right hand side, you can see some of the sewers which run underneath Rome today. Why did the Romans believe in gods and goddesses? How were the Romans entertained? And why then did the Roman Empire fall? If it was this great thing and so strong, why did it go wrong? This next topic, invaders and settlers, will take you to about Christmas time. So what we've gone through today is your main topics that you'll be studying through to Christmas. And after the Romans go, there's a period called the Dark Ages, which is where we don't really know too much about what happened, because not much got wrote down because people were trying to survive at this time. It's quite a tough time in history. But then things start to change as the Anglo-Saxons come to England, and this man on the right hand side, he was a monk called Bede. He started very handily for us, started to write down a bit more, so we have a bit more knowledge about this time period. And we think about, well, were the Anglo-Saxons the founders of Britain? How do you know if something's been founded? What does that mean? Was Alfred the Great actually great? Did King Edward I have all the power? Who could challenge the king back then? Who thought they had a claim to the English throne? It wasn't quite the same thing as it always passing on to the oldest son or daughter like it is today. So we have to investigate, well, who actually had a claim to it. Was the Battle of Hastings won through skill or luck? And how did William I change England? The last slide then just briefly gives you an overview of the rest of the year and what you will be looking at. So the next term we'll be looking at the medieval life and giving us an overview. Particularly interesting bit there is actually looking at the Middle East in the Middle Ages and some of the great developments that they were making in the Middle East that we weren't so good at over in Europe, and trying to understand, well, why were they perhaps a little bit more developed there than we were? The Renaissance period, not a term that you hear an awful lot, but it's what happens at the end of the Middle Ages. You might have heard of some of the people though that we'll look at: Michelangelo, Da Vinci, a couple of others you probably haven't heard of like Vesalius and Harvey. But there's lots of new inventions and changing attitudes, and we have to look at, well, why were these coming about? What had changed to allow these things to happen and to occur? And then we'll move on to the early Tudors. We'll look at Henry VIII's rule and the changing relationship between the church and crown and the impact of that Reformation on people's lives, before moving on to two of his children, Edward VI and Mary I. You'll finish off with his third child, Elizabeth I, in year 8, at the start of year 8. We don't forget her. I hope that this has been useful to you. I hope that you're looking forward to perhaps taking part in some of these lessons. We know that we've changed it slightly this year for you guys coming up to make it even more interesting, but we do have a really positive feedback from our current year 7s, so hopefully you too will enjoy it. Looking forward to meeting you in September.